We wish you a Merry Christmas, we wish you a Merry Christmas, we wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Merry Christmas, everyone.
Merry Christmas.
We apologize that we couldn't be there in person. You know, we'd give anything to have the chance. And if you're seeing this video, that means that our wireless connection wasn't strong enough to do this live, so we apologize to that too. I would have very much liked to have done this in person, or at least online. Uh, but we'll have to do with this. So we wanted to do this video because at the very least we wanted to make sure that we got this to you on Christmas Day, because after all, this is your Christmas present, Mom. So you may be asking, well, what exactly could we be getting you through a computer screen? And that's a good question. So what I have here is a little bit of a presentation, and it's not the entire gift, but it's important that you see this first so that you understand the rest. But we had a bit of a problem getting you a present this year. See, the problem is that what do you get the woman that has everything? I know I appreciate that sounds like a pretty humorous and bold statement at first glance, but if you think about it for a second, you'd likely agree that this is a problem inflicted upon all those that have to shop for you. After all, the question does not suggest that you have all the possessions and riches of the world, but it does allude to the fact that you indeed already have everything that you need. Seriously, give a girl a comfy couch, warm pajamas, and a Netflix account, and she'll be content for days. Make sure she has a steady supply of Philadelphia cream cheese, some stale coffee, and enough cats to qualify for the 2017 Miss Reclusive Cat Lady Award. She won't ever leave the house. Indeed, trying to think of a tangible gift that would truly be of immense value or benefit to you is a rather Sisyphean mental task. Our house is a graveyard of dozens of Christmases and birthdays worth of best intentions and miscalculations. Even I had to give up aiming for success after I saw the final resting place of that Oriental fan I got you from Taiwan last year. That's right, I saw it in the basement, Mom. No, this year, we had to give up on getting something special for you and instead strive to do something special for you. Now, I say we because the inspiration behind this gift did not stem from my bountifully innovative genius, but rather from Dad, a man who is quite often unfairly viewed as rather lacking in the thoughtful department. See, he above all others was the one to understand that the truly greatest gift any of us could give you was, wait for it, a story. Your story. Of course, our gift is one that is naturally incomplete. After all, you're still standing here. You're still writing your story. In doing this, we are in no way suggesting an ending for it. What we instead offer is more of a prelude, a prequel to the saga that began on the 4th of July in the year of 1964 and which still continues on to this very day. We thought it worthwhile to share with you where your story begins, with the hope that this newfound knowledge may aid you in some way as you continue to flesh out future chapters of your own life. The thought process behind this project was simple. While you are undoubtedly a byproduct of your own thoughts, feelings, and choices, it is nevertheless true that your existence is also the end result of 1,000 individual stories that have played out over the course of many centuries, like yours. Each of these thousands of stories represents a person. While the majority of these people never met each other, nor were they even aware of each other's existence, their unique stories all share a crucial commonality. Their stories converge with you. Their collective blood runs through you. Their arduous trials and tribulations, their glorious triumphs, and their spectacular failures all are manifested within you. Their worlds helped shape your world, just like your world helped shape ours. If we are but the outcome of both nature and nurture, then we too are all inexorably impacted by the people that came before us, and undeniably guided by the world they left us to inherit. So this is our gift to you this Christmas. Their stories, your story. Since the beginning of man, questions of purpose and meaning have plagued the sharpest and dullest of minds. Who among us has not at least once stared at the sky and wondered, why am I here? How did this all come to be? And what is the meaning of all of this? Unfortunately, if you're seeking the answers to these questions from this project, then you'll be left with disappointment. Although, as a side note, if you are looking for the answers, I recommend consulting with some of the respected authorities in this field. While we can't answer the whys of your life, we can't answer the hows and wheres. Before we start, it should be noted that we sought to map your lineage through credible, verifiable means. However, as we transgress further back in time, the record becomes murky and obfuscated, forcing us to rely on hearsay and deductive reasoning. We can nonetheless convey with confidence what we believe to be the plot lines behind what we believe will inevitably become a box office hit. Lori Jones, The Beginning. To find the origin of your story, we needed to go back in time. Way back in time. Unfortunately, the earliest records of your origin is hotly contested. Depending on which guy you decide to consult, you'll get a radically different answer. So let's start with the guy on the right. In the beginning, the universe was created. This has made a lot of people angry and been widely regarded as a bad move. If you choose to adhere to the research of Dr. Dawkins and his colleagues, then the beginning of your story begins with a bang. Literally. The Big Bang, or Big Rapid Silent Expansion, as it should be more appropriately named, occurred roughly 13.8 billion years ago. The universe was initially so hot from the energy released that the four forces that govern our world didn't even exist at that time. Eventually, the universe began to cool, and the forces of gravity, electromagnetism, strong force, and weak force began to form. So did matter, coincidentally. These forces governed the shape and behavior of matter, and over millions of years, massive clouds of hydrogen atoms began to condense, pulled inwards by the collective gravity of their individual masses. As their masses grew, so did their gravitational force, causing more and more matter to be pulled in. The pressure exerted on hydrogen atoms within the center of these new supermasses was incredible. Eventually, the heat and pressure was enough that hydrogen atoms began fusing together, releasing huge amounts of energy in the form of light and heat that stretched for hundreds of millions of kilometers in every direction. The universe's first stars were born. This nuclear fusion process, the engine behind these giant stars, continued unabated for billions of years. As hydrogen atoms continued fusing within these stars' cores, they began forming new elements like helium, lithium, oxygen, nitrogen, and carbon. Over time, these bigger, heavier elements proved to be more difficult to fuse than the rapidly depleting hydrogen within the cores of these stars. In fact, heavier elements, especially iron, require more energy to fuse than the amount of energy released from the fusion reaction. Unable to sustain these newer fusion reactions, these supermassive megastars began to sputter out and die. However, they did not die peacefully. They erupted with a bang, spewing their matter billions of light years out into the cosmos, a billion individual little bangs. But this wasn't the end of the universe. It was the beginning of your world. Over time, just like before, this new matter released from dead stars began to condense into clouds due to the influence of gravity. One of these newly formed interstellar molecular clouds had enough hydrogen lying around to condense into a newly formed star, the Sun. Excess matter, either too small in mass or consisting too much of heavier elements, instead formed into smaller spherical objects that began orbiting the Sun. 9 billion years after the Big Bang, our solar system had formed. Earth was one of those spherical objects. At first, it existed as a molten hot ball of magma for another billion years or so before its surface eventually cooled off enough to allow the creation of a solid crust. Not soon after, oceans began forming from condensed water vapor emitted from volcanoes and from water-carrying comets that frequently crashed into the Earth's surface. In these new bodies of water emerged the first signs of life in the known universe, your earliest ancestors. Naturally, you didn't get your thighs and jawline from them. They were only singular organisms after all. Nonetheless, these little guys helped to make your world become a better place, mainly by ingesting huge amounts of carbon dioxide and emitting enough oxygen in the air to support terrestrial life. You'd have to wait another 3 billion years or so before you start seeing any ancestors that more closely resemble you. If we start your lineage with these Homo bros, then we can pinpoint your origins on planet Earth to somewhere around here. Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda. Of your earliest ancestors, Lucy can actually be visited. She's on display in London. And that is probably the most incredible part of your story. Every atom in your body has existed since the beginning of time. The calcium in your bones, the carbon in your hair, and the oxygen in your blood all formed in the hearts of supermassive stars that formed and collapsed over 10 billion years ago. There is a very good likelihood that the atoms in your right hand and the atoms in your left hand came from the center of dead stars that existed hundreds of millions of light years away from each other. After billions of years scattering across the universe, they converged and formed to make you. Your origin begins in the center of a million stars. You are a child of the stars. And your great 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 grandmother is probably being propped up on display in some museum. Of course, if you ask this other dude, he gives a pretty different account of your background. According to him, his dad made the earth about 6,000 years ago and created your first two ancestors. If you're curious, their names were Adam and Eve. Should you find this timeline to be more trustworthy, then it is likely that your origins begin here, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers converge in what is now modern-day Iraq. The next 5 to 10,000 years of your family lineage is a bit opaque. We do know at some point that regardless of them having started in Tanzania or Iraq, your ancestors began migrating into the European continent, where they battled the harshness of winter and new environmental threats. They also came across another group of humans known as Homo neanderthal. In a fashion that would become typical of your ancestors, they didn't get along very well with their new neighbors. Whether they killed them off or simply outcompeted them into extinction, the Neanderthals are all but gone, sans some of their DNA that is prevalent among some communities in Europe. Not yours, though, as far as I know. But it may explain why you're so disposed to grunting when getting up from the couch. Eventually, after tens of thousands of years of living a brutal existence of hunting and gathering, your ancestors finally stumbled onto the cultivation of wild plants and animal husbandry. Their contribution to the agricultural revolution shaped this world in a way that no one else before or after could ever hope to accomplish. From their actions spawned human civilization, and irrevocably changed the world that we live in. Your lineage is entirely broken at this point, but based on the events of time, we can assess what likely happened to them. For the sake of expediency, we'll fast forward over the development of the Greek and Celtic civilizations, the collapse of the Roman Empire, and the fun times of the Dark Ages, and start back up in the 16th century during an era known as the Wars of Religions. The Holy Roman Empire, neither holy, Roman, nor an empire, was in disarray after a frustrated man named Martin Luther nailed the 95 Theses to the door of a church in Wittenberg, Germany. His subsequent efforts to reform the Catholic Church culminated in the Protestant Reformation, which originated in the territories of modern-day Germany and quickly expanded throughout Europe, notably the British Isles. This new movement challenged the authority of the Holy Roman Empire and its Catholic source of authority. This inevitably led to conflicts between Protestants and Catholics. Outbreaks of violence came to a head in the 30 Years' War in the early 17th century. This war ended up being the most destructive and impactful events in European history, which is saying a lot because these guys in Europe, they really love to fight. The internal struggle for power between Protestants and Catholics within Germany spread to encompass almost all of Europe, including Austria, Croatia, Denmark, England, Hungary, France, Poland, Romania, Russia, Scotland, Sweden, Spain. By the time the Peace of Westphalia was signed, the war had claimed over 8 million lives and had reshaped the entire European continent. Among the biggest losers of this war was the Holy Roman Empire, aka Germany, which lost over 30% of its population and was divided into hundreds of semi-impotent kingdoms. The Peace of Westphalia also marked the founding of the newly independent kingdoms of Switzerland and the Netherlands. In the wake of the war's destruction, German territories became further divided among Catholic, Protestant, and Calvinist lines. Those who did not wish to face death or persecution for their religious beliefs were forced to migrate to regions whose religions matched their own. And this is exactly what the family of Franz Graf did. Originally from central Germany, the Grafs moved to Zurich, Switzerland in the 1600s, where they hoped they would find sanctuary for their Protestant beliefs. Unfortunately, the 30 Years' War would not mark the end of religious division in the Germanic states. Violence continued to plague many parts of Germany and Switzerland well into the 18th century. Even in areas that were relatively stable, life was not good for many. Feudalism was still widely practiced in many regions of Germany until 1770, meaning that many peasants acted as serfs or indentured servants to wealthy landlords. Even those who were lucky enough to possess their own land were confronted with a practice of primogeniture, which favored the firstborn son by entitling him to ownership of all family estate. Additionally, the constant warfare led feudal lords to constantly raise taxes, placing incredible pressures on the population. So it's little wonder that your relatives Franz Grove, Gerhard Clemens, Johann Nicol Servas, Jacob Ipperly, Matthias Grimlin, Maria Barbara, Mons Heikel Weidler, and Anna Elisabetha Klein were all attracted to the promise of land and opportunity in the New World. All of them left their homes in southwestern Germany and sailed for the newly established colonies of Pennsylvania in the early 1700s. The horrible conflicts between Protestants and Catholics didn't just take their toll in Germany. They of course made their way to the British Isles, where they wreaked their own havoc amongst heirs to the English and Scottish thrones. You are of course familiar with the Pilgrims who came to the New World to escape religious persecution, yeah? Fortunately, what we can be gathered, the inspiration behind the Pinkertons, Matthews, Browns, Eatons, and Brysons' collective decisions to set sail for the New World did not appear to be influenced by religious motivations. While feudalism had been dying off in Britain by this point, many people still had little land to call their own. As the English crown looked to populate its newfound American colonies, it offered people land there. For many, the promise of a better life cost them only the price of a boat trip across the Atlantic. This was no small sum, however, and many of your ancestors likely indebted themselves as indentured servants to a landlord, whom they would work for to pay off their debts for several years, after which they would be able to procure their own land with their newfound freedom. With some deductive reasoning, it would appear that one such individual looking for a future of plenty was an Englishman named Henry Thompson, who was one of several Thompsons to set on sail on the Ark and Dove ships for the Americas in 1633. The Ark and Dove would eventually make port on St. Clemens Island at the mouth of Chesapeake Bay, where they would found the first settlement of Maryland. The trip was a success, but it didn't occur without some casualties. On the 25th of December, 1633, so we are talking about 400 years ago, wine was passed around the ship members to celebrate Christmas. 30 colonists fell ill from fever brought on by excessive drinking, and 12 of them died. Fortunately for you, for me, and your ancestor Henry Thompson, he either had an amazing immune system or he wasn't much of a drinker. Of course, you discovering that the vast majority of your ancestry came from Germany and the UK shouldn't be a shocking revelation. After all, you could have more or less deducted that likelihood just from knowing the history of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania was home to the largest population of Germans out of all the original colonies. In fact, there were so many Germans in the colony that enclaves of Germans still exist today. You may be familiar with the term Pennsylvania Dutch, which is actually a bastardization of Pennsylvania Deutsch, or Pennsylvania German. The British were naturally found in all of their colonies, so there's no surprises there either. But why did almost all of your ancestors choose Pennsylvania and northern Maryland? There's two main reasons that attracted so many Germans to Pennsylvania, and while we don't know for sure what inspired your aforementioned ancestors to move there, we can deduce that they came for similar reasons. The first was that Pennsylvania was established by William Penn, a Quaker that first opposed violence and believed in the need for religious tolerance. With his Charter of Privileges, William Penn opened Pennsylvania to all Christians, regardless of their denomination. This proved to be incredibly attractive to Germans who were fleeing over a century of religious conflict. And this was in fairly stark contrast to Maryland, where preferences for Catholics in the state eventually led to uprisings and a takeover of the colony by Protestants. The second reason for Pennsylvania's popularity was the fact that Philadelphia, for a while, was the main point of entry for migrants. Naturally, after having just traveled across the Atlantic Ocean, many settlers were eager to find a plot of land and get started on growing crops and building a home as soon as possible. As more and more Germans arrived in Philadelphia and began populating Germantown, this also attracted more Germans who saw these enclaves as support networks they could depend upon in the New World. So, if it hasn't been cognitively established yet, it should be clear to you by now that you're about as American as they come. For all of your immigrant ancestors I can identify, every single one of them arrived and established themselves in the New World prior to the Declaration of Independence, many of them preceding it by 30 or 40 years. While there was some indication that you may have Native American ancestry in your blood as well, research into it was inconclusive. Regardless, unless someone's name happens to be Sitting Bull, you're unlikely to find many people whose lineage has established a presence in the Americas as much as your own. And like you, they loved their home. They were willing to fight and die for their home, and they did. When the colonies broke out into war against the British Crown, your German ancestors heard the call and took arms. John Grove Sr., son of Franz Groff, fought with the York County Militia as a private fourth class, where he likely served as a guard duty for captured Hessian merchants, meaning that John Grove was protecting his new country by guarding German prisoners of war. Jacob Epley Jr., son of Jacob Epley, also served in the war. His brother John and his nephew John Epley Jr. also participated in the Revolutionary War. Your ancestor Samuel McNeill, barely having arrived in Chester County, Pennsylvania from his home in Northern Ireland, also immediately took up arms against the British as part of the Chester County Militia. Although, considering that he was an Irishman, I doubt he even needed to be paid to fight the English. Fortunately, all of them survived the war, and afterwards helped participate in the development of the newly independent United States of America. Their valor and service to the country would later be emulated by their descendants, whom participated in almost every major war the United States was involved in. But freedom and independence did not alleviate the struggles of many of your ancestors. Despite their contribution to the independence movement, the presence of German Hessian mercenaries on the side of the British during the Revolutionary War caused bitterness towards the Germans, leading many to anglicize their names in order to remove social stigmas against them, which would explain why, if you look at your names, they don't sound so much German anymore, but if you look in the past, they very much would have been. While some families, such as the Groves, who were originally the Groffs, were fairly well off, many of your ancestors started off as indentured servants and lived almost the entirety of their lives managing farms, either their own or someone else's. There were some exceptions, however. The oldest brown ancestor I could trace back to, your great-great-great-grandfather Victory Brown, was a stonemason. Your great-great-great-great-grandfather Jesse Thompson and his son Jesse Thompson Jr. were both shoemakers. Your ancestor George Epley was a brick mason. They did not make their living tilling the land. At the same time, the women in your family were still primarily functioning as housewives and baby machines, which was custom at the time, and education for all was rudimentary at best. Samuel Zarphos, the ancestor of your great-grandmother Ivy Zarphos, was illiterate, as well were many in his household. But these were different times, and arithmetic and writing were not pivotal to leading a happy, productive life. Just look at your great-great-great-grandmother Elizabeth Jane Grove. She made the York County newspaper for being the oldest person in the county. She died just 3 months shy of her 100th birthday. It was also interesting times for one ancestral family in particular, the Matthews, whom your maternal grandmother Daisy Matthews comes from, because some of the first to convert to the newly formed Church of Latter-day Saints. That's right, some of your ancestors are Mormons. The first to convert was your great-great-great-grandfather George W. Matthews, who joined in 1843. His brother, John Matthews, was baptized in Salt Lake City in 1864. Before he died in Iowa 2 years later, John baptized two of George's sons, your great-grandfather James Lamar Matthews and his brother Montrevel Octavian, who was later ordained a priest by the church. Interestingly enough, only about half of the Matthews family converted, and there is no indication that any of Lamar's descendants, including your grandmother Daisy, had any interest in Mormonism. German migrants were some of the staunchest opponents of slavery and were crucial to the abolitionist movement. Unsurprisingly, there is no indication whatsoever that any of your ancestors ever purchased or was involved in the sale of slaves. On the contrary, some of them actually hired freed black men to work on their farms. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, your ancestors came to the call of the Union. So we're quite fortunate. Even though you were born in a border state, or your family's from a border state, there was no division of family. They all joined the Union. John Absalom Eaton was wounded during the Battle of Cold Harbor and died at an Army hospital in Maryland. His brother, James Ross Eaton, was reticent to fight at first, but enlisted near the end in 1864, joining Company F, 11th Regiment of the Maryland Volunteers, where he spent his time in Mount Airy in Baltimore. Thomas Eaton joined the 121st Pennsylvania Infantry and was involved in Fredericksburg and Gettysburg. Later on, he was on patrol duty at Appomattox Courthouse during the surrender of General Robert E. Lee. James Clemens was grievously injured by a horse while under the Maryland Cavalry. He too fought in Gettysburg. George Matthews and Jacob Snyder also fought in the Union Army. Again, your ancestors and their family members appear to survive the war unscathed, which means that you can very well drive up the street to Gettysburg if you like and walk on the very same ground that your ancestors did 150 years ago. The nation was still deeply divided after the end of the war, and the country began a period known as Reconstruction. For most of Pennsylvania, the late 19th century was a period of rapid transformation. While many of your family members continued to maintain their own farms or work as farm labor, the expansion of the Industrial Revolution opened up new opportunities for your family members. It also led some ancestors to leave York County for the first time in over 100 years. Your great-great-uncle John Wesley Zarphos worked as a cigarettes manufacturer. Great-great-uncle Harvey Epley was a woodworker, and his brother was a self-employed truck driver for a farm. Your great-uncle Howard Epley transitioned from his position as a machine operator to a truck driver for Atlantic Oil, which saw its boom at the beginning of the Roaring '20s. One second, let me get my battery to charge this computer. Okay. Now, where were we? Alright, so the expansion of America's railroads also offered exciting new opportunities for your ancestors, including your great-great-uncle Louis Doughty, and great access to education meant that everyone was capable of reading and writing now. Everyone had completed at least 4th grade by this point, with many having completed 8th grade. Unfortunately, the late 19th and early 20th century took its toll on your family more than any time since the War of Religions over 200 years ago. The Eatons had survived the Civil War, but they lost 2 boys to the railroads. Your great-grandfather, William Eaton, lost 1 brother after he was struck and killed by a train while working on the lines. Another brother was killed at a railroad crossing. In short, based on your family history, I'd highly advise you stay away from trains. Fortunately, John H. Zarphos, the only relative to appear to have fought in World War I, came back from his service in one piece. And that's saying a lot, as he served with the 316th Infantry, whose actions in France were pivotal to helping to force the unrelenting Germans into a negotiation of surrender. This change in workplace from the farm to factory placed new kinds of burden on families, especially if the head of the house could not find work. Your great-great-uncle John Henry Clemens took in his unemployed brother Charles, his niece, and his mother in 1700. Great-uncle Frank Joseph Brown worked as a laborer on his brother William Brown's farm, who had also taken in his unmarried sister Mary. These burdens did have a silver lining, however. Changes in family dynamics due to economics and movement towards women's suffrage led your female ancestors to take up employment for the first time. Iva Zarfos' sister Mary worked as a tobacco steamer. Great-great-grandmother Harriet Epley's sister Lucy worked as a poster at a chain works factory. Daisy Matthews' sister became a cigar maker. Uh, sorry. Times eventually started going from bad to worse for most of the United States. Surprisingly, the Great Depression did not seem to leave a major toll on your family. Being self-employed and owning farmland, many seemed buffered by the effects of unemployment. We do see some changes in employment for many, but with the census issued in 1930 and 1940, it's impossible to tell if this was a causal relationship between the Depression and their change in professions. But it doesn't mean the times were good. Anecdotally from Grammy and Grampy, times were anything but easy for the grandparents. The Bryson family was hit particularly hard. Elsie's brother Earl was sent away to another family farm to work at 16. Her sister Lita was unemployed in 1930, but was a machine operator in 1940, suggesting that she was helping to make ends meet for the family. Her sister Maud was sewing at a factory. Charles Bryson went from being a carpenter to working on a farm, although he became a carpenter again in 1940. William Eaton's sister Janice was a bakery manager. Disease and accidents were still a tragic problem for your family at this time. Elsie lost a brother to toxemia and scarlet fever at just 10 months of age. Your great-uncle Howard Thompson lost a son to an accidental gunshot wound. His brother, your great-grandfather Charles Thompson Sr., lost a son to dysentery at just 10 months of age. His son's name was Perrydale Thompson. Then, World War II struck home. Unlike previous wars, your ancestors apparently did not feel as though it was their fight to fight. Neither the Browns nor the Brysons had any of their sons join the war effort. The Eatons had 5 of their boys called up for duty, but based on their short tours, all near the end of the war, it suggests that they were drafted. Indeed, of all of your ancestors who participated in World War II, only 2 of them appeared to volunteer to see combat. William Eaton's brother Levi was a warrant officer in Company G of the 21st Infantry, which was involved in the fighting of the last Japanese resistance during the Battle of Mindanao, Philippines. You may remember MacArthur's famous promise to return to the Philippines. Well, Levi made it happen. Grampy will also be pleased to know that the only other member of the family to have volunteered was Charles Henry Thompson Jr., who served at home and in the Asia Pacific between 1944 to 1946. Now at this point, we're entering post-war America. This is also the world of your living relatives, and where your story begins. What is known is no longer gleaned from consensus and veteran documents. It is directly accessible from your parents' lives and from your own lives. Nonetheless, there are some important trends here that help tie up some of the loose ends to your life's prelude. For over 200 years, your ancestors settled in York and Chester County, Pennsylvania, and they stayed there. While a handful were called to the western frontiers, the fact that their family is comprised of some of the nation's earliest pioneers means that they were well established in the borderlands of Maryland and Pennsylvania, and felt no need to leave. After all, the vast majority of people at that time lived on subsistence agriculture. The farm was the family, and the family was the farm. There were no real aspirations of a talk of accomplishing great things. The greatest achievement one can make was to get married and have a family of your own. This required very little beyond basic common sense and a general knowledge of cultivation, meaning that many of your ancestors lived their lives on half the education you did. York County is a small place, and it was even smaller back then. Many of your ancestors knew each other through work, church, and communal life. Some ancestors worked on farm laborers for other families. On at least one occasion, brothers from one family married sisters from another. Some people even divorced one of your ancestors to marry the other. If you talk to anyone from York, there's a good chance you two share a common relative somewhere in the last 100 to 200 years. Even so, there's quite a bit of diversity amongst your ancestors. The Eaton and Epley families are as close to a warrior family as you'll find in the US. Nearly every generation of Eaton and Epleys sacrificed their sons to the nation's cause. While education was of little importance to many of your farming ancestors, the Zafros family was exceptionally keen on their children getting a full education. By the generation of your great-grandmother Ivy Zafros, all the children had completed high school at a minimum, with at least one son having completed college. Keep in mind that college was exceptionally rare in the early 20th century. There is also quite a bit of religious mixing. While all of your ancestors appear to have professed faith in some form of Christianity or another, many denominations make up your line, suggesting that people were willing to look past their differences when it came to love and family. Once we arrive at your generation, we see a tremendous transformation. You were the first of many. You were the first member of your family to be born outside of Pennsylvania and to have lived overseas in over 150 years. You have called home in more locations than any non-military member of your family, sans your mother. You graduated high school and your brother completed university. Before your father, university was a nearly non-existent avenue in life for your ancestors. You were not only the first person to marry someone from outside Chester or York County, you married someone from a different continent. Your trip south to Virginia was one of the single greatest migrations by any of your family members, and you did it alone. You were the first to grow up in a world of antibiotics, TV, and space exploration. You were probably the first of your family not to attend church or to see it necessary to join an institution to profess your faith. From the earliest days when your ancestors were fleeing from persecution and death in Germany to modern times where you sit in the comfort of your home without the worries of hunger and oppression, your family has been involved in the American story every step of the way. Many of them didn't know if they would make it through those harsh few winters. Many of them likely struggled with moving on after having lost young children to illness and injury. Many of them probably returned from war unsure if their lives would ever be the same again. But they all did. No matter what the world threw at them, they picked themselves up, rushed themselves off, and kept marching on forward, forging a path to a better life for the next generation. Amid their blood runs you. You are the collective accomplishment of hundreds of men and women that have overcome all trials and tribulations. Had they given up, had they ever doubted themselves enough to freeze up and cripple their lives, then you or I may have not even been here right now. But they didn't. The problems of the world have changed, and the avenues towards solving them are more nuanced, but the resolve of the people who made you is just the same as it always has been. And perhaps that is the final message your prelude can offer. Problems may wear a different mask, but all the problems are the same, a challenge that must be overcome. The one thing all of your ancestors seemed to share was that they all confronted their problems. They didn't have the choice to sit passively aside. The world shaped them, but they too also shaped the world. In the process, they made you, a German, Scot-Irish, English, maybe Native American mutt of a Homo sapien with the genetic resolve of 100 soldiers, stay-at-home mothers, salt-of-the-earth farmers, callous carpenters, and yes, even some overzealous Mormons. You, Lori Jones, are the byproduct of over 3 billion years of evolutionary triumph in the face of all obstacles. And you have it in you to act like it. So, I didn't just make this speech to you to inspire you without giving you any sort of direction to perhaps challenge yourself in shaping your world as you see fit. And I recognize that in giving you this story, we very clearly set out from the beginning saying that it was not finished. And so my gift to you, or rather our gift to you, does not end with this presentation. Dad has something for you, and he should be handing it to you just about right now. And I'll give him a second in case he's not ready. See, we have understood for a long time that you have issues with confidence and seeking out to accomplish goals you have placed in front of you. And so as you open your gift, I want you to keep in mind that there is something that Megan, Dad, and I have heard you talking about wanting to do since I was born 28 years ago. And to this day, I cannot remember you have actually ever fully accomplished it. So, what we've done is we have started it for you. We went ahead and spoke to Tracy, and we told her that what we'd like her to do is help her, or have her help us to create a scrapbook for you. Now, this scrapbook is of the story I just told you. But as you go through the pages of this scrapbook, you're going to notice something about it. It's not finished. It's not finished because it was not our job to finish it. It is your job to finish it. And Tracy is going to be there every step of the way to help you do just that. See, because if we believe that after 30 years of planning to make scrapbooks, you finally have the opportunity and the resolve to complete your first one, that is a step towards a whole new Lori Jones. One who recognizes that her story is far from over and that she has the wherewithal and freedom to decide how it goes on and how it ends. So, I'll leave you here with this. Merry Christmas. I love you all. I hope you enjoy your gift, and I hope to see it completed when we see you next time. Bye, guys.